All right, great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We're going to talk today about OER as inclusive practice. I'm Cheryl Torsney. You know me. I'm the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs in the Office of the Provost. And you all know Ryan, too, and he'll introduce himself in a second. We are doing this presentation as part of our TBR grant on OER as inclusive practice. The team on this grant includes Ryan and me, Suzanne Mangrum in the library, Erica Stone in the English department, Kim Godwin in MTSU Online, and Bud Fisher, the Dean of CBAS. So thanks for being here, everybody. Next slide. I'll do it that way. So we're going to do this just really, really quickly. We're going to do an OER definition, just some background, talk a bit about OER and inclusion, and then do what I think a lot of you are here for, is to discuss the grant opportunities for revision for courses that are the biggest part of our grant. I think by now, all of you know that OER stands for Open Educational Resources. I know that the first time that I used that acronym for my occasional newsletter, people wrote back and said, "We don't even know what you're talking about. Don't you know that when you first use an acronym, you are supposed to say what it is and then use the acronym in parens?" And of course, I do know that, but we've been so deeply into OER, I just confess that I forgot. Here is the Creative Commons definition of OER. These are materials that are out there available for you. And the real key is that you are able to use them always for 5 activities. We retain them, we reuse them, we revise them, we remix them, and we redistribute them.
Oops.
And here are some definitions. You've probably seen these before. These have been used repeatedly recently to, provide a picture and provide some additional context on what we are talking about. So accessibility, again, is being able to get into the building. Diversity is being invited to the table. Inclusion is having a voice, and equity is having your voice heard. If you can't get into the building, you can't have your voice heard, right? For sure.
Okay, so we want to talk about a few background components, right? So if we're going to talk about OER as an inclusive practice, we have to understand some stuff about both the system of education that we currently work in and sort of inclusion as a concept. And so that's what we want to talk about here. So the first thing to talk about is gatekeeping, right? Like, unfortunately, I think higher ed as a thing has typically been conditioned around this gatekeeping model, right? Where we as faculty position ourselves as experts. And part of what it is that we're doing is like presenting the only right way of understanding things. And part of what it is that we're doing is assessing students on their ability to understand things correctly, or maybe even a narrow set of things correctly. And so what happens is we get these really selective models where, some students can pass and some students can get through, but not everybody can. So this, model is criticized widely, and it's important to recognize sort of the limitations of it, which are many, and sort of in a lot of ways obvious limitations. One thing that sort of gets us farther down the road is to start thinking differently about students. And so there's this distinction between deficit-based and asset-based thinking when it comes to students. So a deficit-based approach is a really useful approach if what we're doing is gatekeeping and keeping people sort of out of learning, because we focus in that model on the things that students don't know or the experiences that they don't have, or their deficiencies, right? On the other hand, we could view students as having different assets, right? So a variety of experiences that are sort of different than mine because they're different than mine, right? Because we come from different places, we have different educational experiences. And the idea here is something akin to what Paulo Freire talks about as problem posing education, where we sort of dissolve the boundary between teacher and student and learn together more deeply, by sharing from our diverse experiences, by if you want, pooling our assets, right? If you know Freire, what Freire talks about is sort of this problem where we typically view education as this thing that where intelligent people who have knowledge sort of deposit that information in deficient students. And that's a problematic model, right? Again, it works if what we're doing is sort of gatekeeping and filtering people between sort of the haves and the have-nots when it comes to education. But that's not, I think, and I'll just talk from personally, that's not what I think education is, or what it is that I'm interested in doing. What I think we should be working on is inclusive teaching. So this quote comes from an advice guide on the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I want to just read it briefly. And I know that's bad pedagogy, but I want to read it because I think the words are important. And so it says, teaching inclusively means embracing student diversity in all forms: race, ethnicity, gender, disability, socioeconomic background, ideology, and even personal traits like introversion is an asset. It means designing and teaching courses in ways that foster talent in all students, but especially those who come from groups typically or traditionally underrepresented in higher education. And I think that that's what sort of, I think that this is important, right? Like if we're going to be teaching, if what we do is teaching, I think that what we're working on is teaching all of the students that we have, not just the ones that look like us or are conditioned to think like us, or conditioned to think in the ways that we think are right, even sometimes. This is a fundamental shift from, in some ways, from what we've done a lot in the history of higher ed, but I think it's an important one. We have brilliant students. We all know this. You wouldn't be here if you didn't know this. We have brilliant students who are coming into our classroom at MTSU. They're coming to our classrooms with lots of assets, with lots of experiences that are valuable. And when we work the best, I think we pool those experiences and we learn together. And the last thing is this image. This is interesting to me, right? And let me say too, I think that the language around inclusion is important, but it's also a little bit difficult. The language of inclusion says at the beginning that the system that we sort of have is kind of good and doesn't need to be changed. So I think inclusion is better than exclusion, but I think that really sort of what we need to be driving towards is creating a better system that's an equitable system for all right from the beginning, and not one that needs intentional inclusion. But here we are, right? We have a system that's a little bit broken, and we need to work on including people. So what we have here is the difference between equality and equity. And I think when we think about this through the lens of teaching, what we have is students who are individuals, right? And they come with a different set of experiences and knowledges, and they each need different support if we're going to lead them towards a common set of learning outcomes or a common set of goals. And so what I would focus on here is this area. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but these different supports. We have the opportunity to support students differently. We don't have to provide the same kind of supports for every student. Every student is an individual. And what we're going to talk about today in the next couple of minutes is ways that OER can support students, and the ways that we can leverage OER to invite students into the system that we have to learn at a high level, and kind of sort of get together and accomplish outcomes together that we wouldn't be able to accomplish individually. Okay, so we have a couple of tips, and I think Cheryl's going to talk us through the first. Well, this is not a tip quite.
Not quite yet, but we're going to talk a little bit more about OER and inclusion. This is the Paris OER Declaration from UNESCO in 2012. I think this is really important when we're talking about inclusion. All nations are obligated to promote and use OER to widen access to education at all levels, both formal and non-formal, in a perspective of lifelong learning, thus contributing to social inclusion, gender equity, and special needs education. This declaration says that we are obligated to promote and use OER to widen access. And that's really very much where our team is coming from. But OER is not just about affordability, right, Ryan?
Yeah, right. So at the base, right, I think the easiest way to read OER is that it's about reducing cost of textbooks. And we're going to talk about reducing cost of textbooks here in a second, because textbook costs are a barrier to success and access. And so when we think about teaching from an inclusive perspective, we need to think about the cost of access. But at the end of the day, OER is not simply about affordability, right? What OER does is it makes fundamental sort of reformations of what information is and how information functions in the classroom. Right. So if we go back to the definition, what we're talking about with OER is information that exists in the public domain. That's a significant change just by itself. It's information that exists for people, unencumbered by other licenses and unencumbered by other problems of access. And what we have here is that, you know, it allows us to reposition students as evaluators and creators of information, and not merely as sort of passive recipients of previously determined information that's previously determined to be correct, right? So there is a very big sort of social justice commitment that's in the background of OER that I think we run the risk of losing when we focus exclusively on affordability. Not that affordability is unimportant, it's very important, but there's more to OER than just affordability. And so we wanted to make sure we start with that, because OER makes different assumptions about what happens in the classroom and about who students are and who's able to produce and access and assess information. And these assumptions, I think, are really critical. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Cheryl's going to tell us about some access issues with
Yeah.
OER.
So OER increases access, right? It does away with this barrier of cost, which is significant. It allows people to retain materials. So, you know, when our students rent textbooks, they have to return them. When they get the first day access electronically, when they purchase that access goes away. Not so with OER. Students are able to retain their information and to share them. And it also uses common and accessible platforms like, you know, like PDF, for example.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that, you know, those benefits seem to be immediate and seem to be confined to a class at a time, right? Like, it makes sense conceptually to think if it's easier for students to get a textbook for one class, it's going to be easier for them to do well in that class and they're going to have a better grade. But what I think is interesting about this slide is it points to a larger benefit of accessibility or of removing the barrier of access when it comes to textbook cost. I mean, if you look here, we have a high percentage of students who are choosing not to purchase expensive textbooks, even though they know that's going to affect their grade negatively. And I would suggest also, when we have lowered or decreased student grades, we also have the potential that students are losing scholarships, making slower progress towards their degree, not getting into degree programs. Like if you think about MTSU's candidacy program, right? So individual course grades actually affect more than just the grade in that course. They affect sort of programmatic or systematic components that happen in the larger curriculum of higher ed. Right, and we could say the same thing here. Half the students are taking fewer courses or not registering for specific courses because of their textbook costs. You know, that's a lot. What we want, I think, we want to create an environment where all students have the ability to learn and thrive and learn what they want and what they need and thrive in any classroom, right? OER and reducing the barrier of textbook costs gets us closer to that than continuing with high price textbooks, I think. That's a little bit soapboxy, I apologize.
So the national average of what students are paying for textbooks per year is $1,240 on textbooks. Students' families do not calculate for those costs. They think about tuition. They think about fees, maybe, but they don't think about this additional $1,200 per year for textbooks. It comes as a shock. They don't purchase them. Sure, we have a textbook program at the library. Thank you, all you folks at the library. The library purchases those textbooks and keeps them available for students to use in the library. But again, the students don't get to retain the information from those books. They don't get to retain forever the stuff that's in OER.
Yeah, and the reality there is then the students who are buying textbooks are buying textbooks and getting loans to pay for their costs, right? And we know that student loans is a problem, and that reduces or that provides a lot of problems for students after school. I think the national average is someplace just under $40,000 students are coming out of an undergrad experience with in loans. So we're talking about a $1,200 cost that by the time it gets paid off is much more substantial than $1,200. So these impacts are big and they're long. The next thing to mention with OER provides immediate and perpetual access. So, you know, I teach with only OER. Well, that's not entirely true. The major part of my teaching is with OER. What we have is I can share a link to an openly published textbook with my students on or before the first day of class, and they access that textbook simply by clicking the link, right? They don't have to log in. They don't have to create a username. They don't have to use the SSO from MTSU. They don't have to go through our LMS. They can get the textbook in a number of formats immediately and without logging in. Okay, so what we lose with that is we lose some data collection. I'm not sure that that's useful anyways, but what students gain is they gain convenient and quick access to materials that will help them. So there's no subscription, their sort of stuff doesn't go, their access doesn't go away, they have direct access, and then, you know, that's just beneficial. It's cleaner, it's easier for students. Okay, and what we see is, this is from a large study out of the University of Georgia, but what we see is that the benefits of using OER are sort of across the board. Everybody benefits from increased access to textbook materials. And this specific study, it's measuring a number of access or a number of benefits. The one I've highlighted here is just GPA. Students get higher grades according to this study with OER. Okay, fine. It's across the board, but it's sort of, there's a disproportionate benefit or an increased benefit to those students who are at the lower socioeconomic status. And that makes sense because those are students who are struggling to afford textbooks anyways. So if we remove a barrier for entry into sort of the learning model, we get benefit, right? And we get benefit specifically for those students who struggle to afford textbooks overall. But everybody also benefits from increased access and from removing that barrier of cost.
Okay. So the syllabus sort of sets the stage for OER as inclusive practice. And this was, there was a really nice presentation done a couple weeks ago by Dr. Chevret and Dr. Jones on diversifying your syllabus for inclusive instruction. You know, there are all kinds of ways that the syllabus can be shaped to be more inclusive, to change the tone. One of the ways is merely to use a different pronoun. We will learn, you know, X, Y, and Z, whatever the learning outcomes are, not you will. There's an annotated syllabus activity here. Ryan, you want to pop that up and folks can just have a brief look?
Sure. Ooh,
Can we do that?
yeah, I'm working on it. So this is a lesson plan. This comes out of, if you don't know about these resources, uh, this is a set of resources about creating community and online classes. And this is a lesson plan for an annotated syllabus activity. What is interesting about this, I think, is it adds a layer of collaboration into a document that we typically think of as absolute and static. And so, you know, what this simply does is it uses hypothesis. And if you're familiar with that source or not, hypothesis is a web annotate, a collaborative annotation system that exists for free on the web. But it uses hypothesis to sort of ask questions and think through problems and details, and maybe even if you want, move towards sort of a collaborative course design just with the syllabus. What I think is specifically interesting about that system is that it allows for sort of the collaborative and learning model to start right with the syllabus. So it's a modeling and renorming activity as much as anything. So it's sort of an open approach to what a syllabus is and can be. So the link is there, follow it. There's a ton of other really interesting stuff in that set of resources also.
Here is a draft OER syllabus statement that you can use that talks about the course materials and gives a brief definition of OER, and then allows you to say, to give your name and your funding source and talk about why you have opted to use OER, which is because of our commitment to student access and excellence. It makes clear that students will not be paying extra for a textbook. Let you have a look at that for a second.
Yeah. Okay. The other benefit of OER when it comes to inclusion, or not the other, another benefit of OER when it comes to inclusion is the varied access paths that OER sort of allows. So if we think from a universal design for learning perspective, right, design choices that people make impact the sort of the ways in which people interact with the real world. So this is just an interesting example of a fire door, right? So we can see that design choices about how people interact with a door and sort of manipulate that access point sort of impact the people who can easily use that access point. And by making a choice that's good for everybody, everybody benefits from it. We can do the same thing with OER. With OER, one of the things that happens is we're not confined to any kind of proprietary system or format. So this allows us to put students in the position of choosing the best way for themselves to interact with material. Okay, so here's a table out of a chart. The specifics are not entirely important. What this article studied was how students are looking at access, how they're accessing OER materials. And what I wanted to highlight is they're accessing it in multiple formats and different formats. Right? And their access changes sometimes. You can look at this article if you want. It's showing changing access patterns throughout semesters even. So students might start looking at a PDF and they might end up looking at an EPUB. Okay, that's fine because we put students in a position, when we offer multiple access points, we put students in a position of making the choices that are best for them, not sort of accommodating themselves to the choices that are best for me.
So remixing, which is one of the, defining reasons that OER are so useful, is absolutely inclusive. You're not stuck with the examples or the photographs that appear in a textbook that your students have purchased. You can swap out photos. You can revise word problems by using names, for example, that come from other cultures, from different locations that make better sense, or that would introduce some of your students to other kinds of locations, for creating examples and case studies that, that perhaps are invented by your students. By allowing this remixing and this creating, you establish a kind of authenticity that is more meaningful for students.
Yeah, and then the last thing that I wanted to point, or that we want to point out, is that OER highlights knowledge creation. Okay, so it's not entirely about, right, as we said before, it's not entirely about sort of students being transmitted into, right, that they're going to just receive sort of a whole lot of predetermined or information that's predetermined to be correct. But rather, with OER, we provide a framework and a foundation for students to become makers and not consumers. And this moves us towards open pedagogy, which is really a different topic. But we wanted to make sure that there was that connection between open pedagogy and OER. I think the two really go hand in hand together quite well. And so we'll be talking about open pedagogy in the future. Oh, sorry, there's one more point that I forgot about. This is maybe mine to talk about too. The other thing that we wanted to mention, OER, because it's free, it's high quality, free, and easily accessible information. It can serve as a really vital supplement for students. So on the one hand, we can remix class content in process. So when students are struggling with a concept, we can provide additional resources that are high quality to help them get through the struggle of complicated and difficult concepts. There is one example that I would provide from my own teaching. When we pivoted last March to this remote and distance learning environment, students were really struggling to figure that out. There was a group of students from up in British Columbia who wrote an OER textbook about how to learn online. And because students in my classes were struggling to figure out how to learn online, I was able to sort of present that material to them, and we had a whole bunch of different conversations that were sort of just about their struggle and were really helpful. And then the other thing is OER can provide academic support, right? So I know from teaching a lot of stuff that there are concepts that students typically struggle with. I can use a variety of OER sources to really get into and to provide supplemental and supportive resources around those concepts that are going to be more difficult and hard. So OER serves a couple of different functions there. Okay, now we're going to pivot and we're going to talk through some of the grants that are available, and Cheryl's going to lead that part of the conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so our $100,000 grant from TBR has as the bulk of the grant, faculty grants for faculty on our campus to embrace equity through OER. we are encouraging you to adopt OER or to create your own OER and design your courses around them. We have a number of award levels, 3 of them. There's something we're calling small scale alteration, which is really for a course that you are teaching, medium scale conversion, and a large scale transformation that might be for an entire gateway course that is taught by multiple faculty members. Let me see next. So here's the first small scale alteration award level. So we're looking at a single course. We're looking at replacing something that is expensive, either a textbook or a lab manual or some kind of platform with an OER alternative. You can see the minimum, the maximum, and the maximum per team member. That's the small scale alteration. Something bigger is the medium scale, right? Every one of these awards should result in an OER adoption by multiple instructors, replacing student material with OER. And these grants are a little bit bigger, right? In fact, twice as much. But the big kahuna is the large scale transformation, right? We are looking at large scale transformation for gateway courses. Frequently, these gateway courses, often in STEM, are the courses that cause students to drop out, okay? There are lots of opportunities to adapt, or create OER. Loads of different OER out there for these gateway courses. Perhaps the most well-known of these are the OER from OpenStax out of Rice University in Houston. So our grant timeline is April 25th. That's the submission deadline. Here is the link for the application, and successful grants will be announced by mid-May. The idea is to do the adoption, adaptation, or creation over the summer with the hope of starting with the OER in the fall. Spring at the latest. Okay.
Okay, so that's a ton of information, and it's a ton of information about a couple things. All right, hang on. Let's go back. Yeah, we have a the deadline that we say here is the 25th, and the website says the 23rd. We will figure that out, and so let's just operate around the 23rd, and I'll change this PowerPoint when we send it out. Thanks, Katie, for raising that question.
Thank you, Katie.
So it's a lot of information, and it's information that's sort of in a number of different directions. So we've talked about inclusion and access, and we've talked about grant programs that leads towards OER. And so, you know, we have plenty of time for questions, about 25 minutes for questions. I see that there are some questions in the chat. I'm going to stop the screen share and we can just talk with each other. You know, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat what question you have.
I had sort of a long question here. That's why I ended up typing it out. And, I've heard about OER a couple years ago in one of the MTSU board meetings, I believe it was voiced. And so ever since then, I thought that was very exciting, and I was glad you were doing this. And because I teach in such a technology-driven field, UX, UI, and design, digital design, it makes a lot of sense for my department. My question is, how does my time spent creating this material equate to the time I could spend pursuing publishing opportunities that would that seem to be, or have been told to me to be valued on my OFD towards tenure. So, you know, we're always looking for those publishing opportunities, but OER doesn't seem to quite be the same thing.
It is not exactly, and this is undoubtedly my question. It isn't the same thing, but Sherry, there are ways that you can go about finding OER and creating and assembling OER that might not necessarily take a whole heck of a lot of time away from the other kinds of activities that you need to demonstrate high quality for your OFD. I would refer everybody to the recording of Kim Godwin's presentation in this series, maybe last week, couple weeks ago. And what she does is go through all of these, or not all of them, but a whole bunch of repositories, and shows you how you can search for specifically OER in your field. That might not take a whole heck of a lot of time, certainly not the kind of time you're talking about in doing a research project and searching for publication and bringing that to publication. But I think it's important to know that in the revision of the tenure policy 204 document, we do have the language of born digital.
Okay.
What counts? I hope that is a helpful answer.
I think so. I mean, I guess if I were to write a grant and it got accepted to do some of this material, I mean, that would probably go, well, it goes under grant. So it is somewhat of a peer-reviewed research process. It's it sounds like it's just not the same thing as publishing, if I'm getting that correct.
I think that is undoubtedly correct, but I will check specifically with my department chair.
Okay. All right. I'll check out Kim Godwin's presentation
By all means.
Is this something that maybe could be published like in an I'm like not, that's like not my field, but like in an educational journal where you're like, listen, I converted this course and these are the materials that we're using, is more of like a pedagogy methodology kind of thing where like you might still be able to get a publication out of it?
Yeah, so I would say the answer to that is undoubtedly yes, right? The Scholarship of Teaching and Learning is sort of a larger pedagogy-focused publication group, I guess, and there's a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning sort of application in a number of disciplines. And so certainly that's one way to publish this kind of material. So yeah.
For sure.
I have a question. What levels of faculty are eligible for the grant? Because I'm non-tenure track, but I am full-time, and I teach 5 survey classes in US history. So I have a large number of students.
FTTs are eligible for this.
Cool, thank you.
Sure.
So David, I'm working backwards in the chat, so I apologize. I know that's not the best strategy, but it's just the way it's going to be. David asks, how are the monies to be spent that are awarded? We envision these monies to be spent sort of as we have, it's compensation. It's compensation for the time that it takes you to redevelop a course around OER. So we're working, there are a couple of there are a couple of tech things that we're trying to work out to support adaption and creation of OER. And so we'll present information on that as we have it. But in general, the money is supposed to be to compensate you for your time. Lane has a question about timing, about using these grant funds for online redesign that's due later. I'm not quite sure how to answer. It's a question. Lane, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? And then
sure, thanks. So our team was thinking about it's time to redesign our prereq and our senior capstone. And so we were thinking about doing OER conversion at the same time, but the course hasn't been approved to be offered for the first time through MTSU Online until summer 2022. So the content wouldn't be rolled out to students until summer. And I heard Cheryl's comment about fall or spring. So I'm just wondering about the timing, what doesn't quite align.
Lane, I think that the best thing might be to send an email to me and Cheryl, and then we can get into the specifics of it and and try to address that specifically.
Yeah, but
I also would say, I know the classes that you're talking about. Robin DeRosa at Plymouth State in New Hampshire has a book on integrated research and integrated interdisciplinary studies that I think would be a really great base for that course. So I can send you.
That's one that's on our list. We found several through Project Muse. So, I mean, I feel like we have some good options. And so we have a team of faculty who are interested, but I just wanted to make sure before Diana did the application.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, Joan asked a question in the chat about what a large number of students means. Is that, I think that that's in relation to the stage 3, the biggest. Is that correct, Joan?
That's right.
Yeah, well, we're talking about those gateway courses. So thousands of students, right? Take, you know, English 1010 or Chem 2020, courses like that.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also say with that, you know, this is the first time we're offering these grants. So if you think you fit someplace, make the case. And if you don't, we'll work with you to recategorize things as we review the grant. So if you're saying, I'm going to do a small scale grant, and we look at it and we're like, no, you're not, that's a big scale grant. We'll move you up and we'll help you locate yourself in this thing. So I know it's confusing. What other questions do you have? I think, have I missed anything in the chat?
I have another question. I teach both 2010 and 2020, first half of US, second half of US. Would I need to apply for 2 separate grants to redevelop or alter, however I figure out what I'm gonna do, each one, or can I do it as one? Since it's, so do I need 2 separate grants for each course? Or just one grant because it's my entire portfolio that I teach?
Right.
For that one, I would also suggest, Anne, that you email Ryan and me.
Okay, all right. I'm going to touch base with my department head as well and see if anybody else is interested in it.
Perfect, perfect.
And the other thing, yeah, that's what I was going to say. The other thing is that there's a lot of room for collaboration here, and that could be really helpful. Sorry, Jessica, I cut you off.
No, it's okay. I thought you were done. Yeah, so I teach a course, I teach sensation perception and psychology. So it's only like 35 students a semester, but it is a required course and they have to take it before they graduate, and it's very difficult. And so I guess my question is actually just sort of how broad the OER stuff is. So like olfaction, for instance, that's what I study, but it's a very small field. And I expect that information in regards to like sensory processing of olfactory stimuli is pretty esoteric and will not maybe be like widely available in a pre-existing just OER resource. So like, what is like, can you give me a better idea of what those things look like and what happens if there isn't a pre-existing OER?
Okay, check in the chat Kim Godwin's link to her presentation. Okay, 1206. When she was doing the presentation, there were some pretty esoteric things. She just asked folks who were in the workshop, you know, give me some ideas. And there were some things tossed out, and I thought, I have no idea what that even is. Kim typed it in and stuff came up. Have a look at some of her resources, type in olfaction, and I would be surprised if multiple things do not come up.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
the other thing that I would add to that is that, you know, these grants can be used to support the creation of OER materials. So it's not just taking stuff up that other people have created. And you know, we could make an argument that if there is not something that exists for olfaction, You could make the argument that the grant wouldn't support the development of a whole textbook, but it would support the development of resources for a unit. And I think that we would be interested in hearing that. So it doesn't have to be complete change. It can be partial change as well.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Because I mean, I like, honestly, the textbook we currently use is garbage and the other ones are twice as expensive, if not more.
Yeah.
So I've been hesitant to switch textbooks because of the
cost.
Yeah, very severe price increase. I mean, the one we use is not cheap, but it's like $100 versus like $250 versus like $350. So I would definitely like to take advantage of this. And this is going to be like my main like bread and butter course. So I think it would be really useful to me, but I just don't know if like everything would exist. So, okay.
Well, and the other thing to consider too is you can do a combination of open access, which is sort of material that we own someplace on campus through a subscription. So you can do a combination of open access and OER sort of to cover that transition period. So it's not, you know, specifically all OER or no OER. There's a lot of sort of in the middle that we can do.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess I've been thinking that, I mean, whatever, this is probably more detailed than is useful for this particular forum, but the textbook that we use, one of the reasons that it was selected by, I mean, I'm teaching like the officially approved online version right now. And one of the reasons it was selected is because it has this free, like these little virtual labs that students can do, and they aren't behind a paywall. So is that something that falls into like OER? It's like associated with a textbook that you're supposed to pay for, but like the previous professor selected this book because students that don't buy the textbook can still do these labs. Yeah. So, I mean,
yeah, that's interesting. I don't know the answer to it, but it's interesting. Yeah, and I think that between the people who are on the steering committee and the advisory group for this grant, we can help you answer that question.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah,
for sure, for sure. I'm just looking at the chat. David, did we answer you about how the funding is to be spent? It's for your time. Great. Okay.
What other questions do y'all have?
I have a question. This is Michelle. I have a question about courses that may be mixed up in the larger university or College of Liberal Arts Gen Ed redesign. Can you still apply for a grant for a course that may end up being reconfigured when we know more information about the Gen Ed redesign?
Yeah, I would say so. The Gen Ed isn't yet redesigned, so we have to, in that regard, I think we have to improve the classes that are currently in the Gen Ed program. And I think, you know, I feel like that makes sense. So I don't know. That would be my quick yes.
I would say ditto.
Thank you.
What else? Any other questions that we can help you with?
I'm most curious, and I'm going to talk with Suzanne about this soon, but I'm most curious about distinguishing between OER and, I guess, use the term open access. So in other words, there's a textbook that was put online by a group in the Netherlands on genocide studies, so that anyone can teach their book at any time. But it's not open access. I mean, it's not OER, I don't believe. You can't just take the book and cut it apart and make it your own. And I would love some rules of thumb for how to know whether something is is OER versus open access.
Yeah, so the rule of thumb, I think, is if you go back to that definition, it's the 5 R's, and I'm not going to remember all the 5 R's now.
Oh, no. I get that. I get what it is. How do you find out whether the
How do you find
qualifies?
out? Most typically, OER materials are licensed by a Creative Commons license. So with OER, it leaves all of the permissions to reuse and remix and all of that stuff with the user, and not so long as they sort of credit the author, the permissions are with the user. So the other thing that I would mention is the distinction between open access and OER. I feel like that's really significant for us as faculty members. I feel like it's less significant to students, right? They're just looking to get materials, and if they can get them at a lower cost, that's better. So I think it's an important distinction for us to understand as we're thinking about using and creating resources. But at some point, we just have to find resources that are good for our students. So that textbook in specific, that sounds like an interesting thing that's useful for students. And even if it's not OER, that's okay, I think. I don't know that that answers your question entirely, Elise.
I absolutely think, yeah, you can use a combination of them. But for example, at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, some of their material can be used any way you want to use it. And some of their material has some form of copyright. Right. And I can't always tell. Now, is that, do I have to get in touch with the museum? Or is there a way to determine from the outside which is which?
I think you're going to ask Suzanne.
Okay, that's what I plan to do.
Yeah, we'll talk.
I was gonna, the short version that I use for that is if I have to log in to something to get access to it, then it's not completely open. If it is freely available on the internet, I may not be able to edit it or change it, but I can still get to it. My students can get to it without accessing it through like the library login or my single sign-on at the university. That's usually what I use as my quick determiner is, did I have to have some sort of permission to get to it? And if I have to have permission, that is what keeps the difference between the two types.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense to me. And one of the things I've come up against, for example, in another context, like designing a rack card for a program, they're like, you have to use these images that, whatever they have, what is it called? Something 1, 2, 3, where you can only get photos from there. And I found a photo in there that would be perfect. And they said, no, wait, this one says, only if you're doing this, but not if you're using it for these kinds of things. And they're fairly complicated in terms of, they just said, nah, let's not worry. Let's not try that. And I just want to be really clear about what's open and what's not.
Yeah, and I also think, and this is the sad truth, that if it isn't clearly openly licensed, then it's usually a traditional copyright.
Yeah.
And then you have to get permission. But
yeah, even if you can, and my students can access it anytime they want on the, say, the Holocaust Memorial Museum website, but I can't gather some of that stuff together to make a packet or a handout kind of thing.
Yeah. And I guess that's another good thing, though, about getting involved with OER is that I think the more of us that join this community, the more we see the power of sharing our work and openly licensing things, and that it doesn't mean that you'll never get credit and that everyone's going to take what's yours. It means that
I think we've lost Suzanne.
Things more usable for what we need and more customizable.
Sorry, Suzanne, you froze up for me and I didn't understand what you were saying.
I think she froze up for everybody.
I think she froze.
Yeah, I froze up. I'm sorry. I was just saying that it's one encouraging thing about OER and like getting involved with an OER community is that the more you realize that you're not going to lose your stuff, your stuff becomes more shareable and customizable for what you need. That you're not giving up ownership. It's not that nobody will ever give you credit again. So it's a good community to get involved with and to start looking for stuff there.
All right, what other questions do we all have?
Well, let us know if you have additional questions. Just shoot us an email. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope we get some applications from all of you. Thanks a bunch. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.
Hey, quick question. Is it possible